Let's see. I don't think I have any announcements to make. We're working our way forward. We're making some fairly good progress these days, so that's good. We were talking about the Bauhaus, which is this architecture school that was founded after the war, the year following World War One. Originally in the city of Weimar, and then moved in 1925 to the city of Dessau, all because of politics, governmental change. And the building you see at the left is the most well-known of all of the Bauhaus architectural projects, which is the building itself. And it reflects, as we were talking, the principal tenet of the Bauhaus, which is that form follows function. They're the progenitors of that phrase that you may have heard otherwise, right? They certainly made it strong. And they really did champion a sort of machine aesthetic, right? A group of aesthetic choices that are based on machinery, because what they were hired to do in the first place was to figure out how to wed old school craftsmanship design with modern industry to make sort of affordable things for the masses. It sort of sounds proto-IKEA, doesn't it? Right? Only the one thing that they didn't do is scrimp on materials. Right? They would have hated pressboard as much as we do. Right? They make stuff that's not going to fall apart in a year and a half, or next time you try to change houses, right? And Gropius comes up with a curriculum for the Bauhaus that leads from theory to practice, right? You would move from sort of art theory, work your way through courses on form, then work your way to particular courses on materials, and eventually the idea was the Bauhaus would bring it all together, right? That a work of architecture was the site for the intersection of all of the arts, right? Would come together at the building site. And that made it very similar to what we talked about with De Stijl, right? And this is why Van Doesburg sort of proposed that the two get together unsuccessfully, right? He really wanted to sort of take over the Bauhaus. In a way, and really was not successful that way, because the Bauhaus didn't see themselves working in, precisely and exclusively in a sort of De Stijl idiom, right? But there's similar approaches, and they did have a lot to play off each other. Right? So in order to teach this new curriculum that he had come up with, which doesn't sound all that weird to you and me, I mean, it doesn't sound all that groundbreaking, but in 1919 it was, I guess 100 years ago, right? Next year. So 100 years ago, this was like radical. Now it's sort of normal, and that's important. I think if we talk about what was the great impact of the Bauhaus, it's that what was seen radical in 1919 is now seen as absolutely run-of-the-mill, right? Kind of melding of theory and practice and a sensitivity to materials, right? Well, in order to teach this new curriculum, he hires artists, and Gropius is, and this is the other great, I think, sort of importance of the Bauhaus, is the fact that it became this melting pot for numerous movements around, particularly Germany, right? That come, but broader than that come into the Bauhaus and play a role together there, and have these ideas play off each other. And a lot of things we've been looking at were there. So Lionel Feininger is this American expat who was working in this kind of cubist, futurist sort of style, right? And he is the very first person that Gropius hires to work at the Bauhaus. So he's part of the faculty there. And in fact, he was the longest serving of anybody who was active at the Bauhaus. He was there from the beginning all the way to the point when the Nazis shut it down in 1933 or 34. Right? Because they were too radical for the Nazis, right? So Feininger had sort of the longest stay of anybody. And his early works are these sort of quasi-cubist works, but also with a certain lean toward expressionism, because, Cubism was kind of everywhere. And as we saw, he designed the first Bauhaus cover for their manifesto, right? In this sort of expressionist style, this quasi-medieval woodcut, right, of the Cathedral for Socialism. But there's an architectural quality to a lot of his work, and this is probably what attracted Gropius. Zerkhouse 7 is it 7 or 8? 7 is one of a series of images he did of this church, this sort of rural church, right outside. I think it's outside of Berlin. And so it's inspired by architecture. And we saw also a street of barns, another sort of cubist work inspired by architecture. And this is what made Feininger in particular very attractive to Gropius, right? Now, I said he's an American. His parents were both German expats to America. And he had moved back to Germany already like when he was like 16 years old. So by this point, he'd been there for the better part of 30 years. By the time he's hired by Gropius. It's not like he's a kid or anything like that, right? He's been around. But his becomes one of a number of ideas that are jumbling around at the Bauhaus. And with this idea that the Bauhaus has, that architecture is the intersection of all of the arts, right? It is the place where all of the arts come together. It should come as no surprise that some of the other architects and artists that he hires are actually members of the constructivist group. Because if we think about what is Bauhaus about the Bauhaus, it almost all sounds just like constructivism. Truth to materials. Let the materials define the design, right? Don't design something that would look the same in wood as it would in brass, right? You should take into account the nature of the materials as you come up with the final design, because the design should speak the voice of those materials, right? And constructivism was a movement that was really very much based on this idea of allowing the constructive material to show through in a sort of undecorated manner, right? And we saw that some of the constructivists were very much interested in architecture as a place of intersection between the different arts. Liszewski in particular, right, was very much into these Prown rooms that he makes, right, which are these sites of intersection. So these are very much ideas that are going to be relevant to the Bauhaus. And so Moholy-Nagy, who we looked at when we talked about the constructivists, was hired in 1923 by Walter Gropius to come and teach some of the theory courses at the Bauhaus. He's hitting all the sort of heavy hitters, all of the most prominent avant-garde artists from around the world, really. Moholy-Nagy was Hungarian, but spent quite a bit of time in Germany. And when we discussed him as a constructivist, we looked at these things already, but these were all made while he was at the Bauhaus, right? So there is a sort of a seamless overlap there. He may be a constructivist at heart. He may be a constructivist by theory, but he's also a Bauhaus artist because they share so many of the same sort of agenda items, right? They're really both trying very much to do the same thing. When we think about Z7 as a work, when we think about what the Bauhaus was created to do, right? What they're trying to do, what Gropius is trying to do, is get his students to make prototypes that can then be mass-produced, right? A handcrafted prototype that industry can then mass-produce for everyone. It's a good design for the world, right? That's kind of part of its socialist idea, right? Well, when we look at the title of this painting on the left, Z7, it ends up sounding like a prototype number, doesn't it? You know, it doesn't really, it's not a descriptive title in any particular way. And certainly Moholy-Nagy, I think, is thinking in these sort of Bauhaus ideas of craftsmen, artists making prototypes that can then be mass-produced. Right. He documented, as a photographer, we talked about the interesting angles he often chooses and how they end up converting the physical world into a series of geometric intersections, right? To where it becomes more interesting almost as a piece of design. We stop thinking of it as a structural building. And he used his camera not only to make wonderful compositions like the radio tower that we talked about before, but also to document life at the Bauhaus. So numerous pictures of other Bauhaus students hanging out at different Bauhaus spaces. This is, in fact, the students' housing building. And each of the student housing dorms got their own little balcony because they believed in fresh air, right? Imagine if we had that. Wouldn't that be a nice thing? You could go out and sit on your balcony and, do whatever you like to do on a balcony. But you just have plants out there, if nothing else, right? And so here's a student playing on the railing there. And again, I think you can see the two of these side by side and understand this sort of constructivist composition of angles, right? These really dramatic diagonals that intersect is totally constructivist, but it's all from having that proper eye, right? I think even to this day, we could all learn a lot from looking at a lot of constructivist art insofar as enlivening some really dull compositions and dull designs. The constructivists are absolutely fantastic that way. And it was his interest at the Bauhaus of exploring materials, right? That's one of the things Bauhaus does. You explore the material. You figure out what it can do, what it can't do, and you try to figure out some things it can do that maybe nobody's ever thought of before. This is part of the Bauhaus curriculum. And so when Moholy-Nagy decides that he's going to start making photographs without a camera because of the nature of the material of the photosensitive paper, right? That you don't need a camera to make images on photographic paper. All you need is light and something to block it, right? It's that rudimentary understanding of what photography is that led Moholy-Nagy from taking photographs to making photograms, right? He's understanding the material, he's seeing potentials that no one else had seen, and he's exploiting it. And I think a lot of that has to do with this Bauhaus interest in materials and the relationship between the final object and the kind of material you're using to make it, right? Understanding the nature of the medium. Again, the talent that was there is phenomenal. Kandinsky was hired, right? Kandinsky came in 1921 he taught basic design. I mean, can you imagine? Your basic design prof is Kandinsky, of all people, right? You're learning color from the man who wrote about it. You're learning design from the man who understood that a composition is nothing but design, that it's not representational, right? He was hired in 1921 by Gropius to come and teach the basic design class. Now, Kandinsky, after we left him off, right, we traced Kandinsky's career up to right the beginning of the war, 1914 or so, right? When the war broke out, Kandinsky went back to Russia to ride out the war, and he lived in the same building as Lissitzky in Moscow, right? He became sort of part of this circle of artists, mostly constructivists, right, as we're just sort of morphing from suprematism to constructivism, 1914 to 1918. Kandinsky is hanging around them, and he's seeing what they're doing, and it totally transformed what he does from what he'd used to do, which was much more organic forms, right? Things that looked like amoebas and whatnot, curves and arches, and forms that were based on a sort of distilled natural vocabulary, like horses, right? Mountains and rainbows and whatnot, right? And everything sort of had an organic feel. And then he ends up going to Russia and he picks up these geometric forms, right, that we see in the later compositions. And he begins to do this already in the teens, late teens, and then he's hired by Gropius probably in part because he's a constructivist. Gropius seems rather sort of taken with the constructivists, which kind of makes sense. He's giving them a practical outlet for their ideas. Move past art to making architecture. Some of them are already doing that anyway, right? Really, I used to, before I even knew much about Kandinsky, I had this on a coffee cup. I just think it's a really terrific composition. One of my favorite Kandinskys. Which reflects now for him this new interest in sort of precision. His earlier pictures, the expressionist ones from the aughts and the early teens, all of the forms were very gestural, right? They were very freehand. There was nothing in them that suggested a ruler or a protractor, right, or any kind of mechanical intervention. They were all the hand and the spirit. And I think he still believes in that, but at the same time, almost all of the forms that we see here, almost all of them, not all, but almost all of them, have a sort of precision and rigor to the way in which they have been applied to the canvas. So we have straight edge lines, right? We have some sort of protractor, probably just a string, right, to draw our circles with. And then it's enlivened with this sort of one freehand, snake in the middle of it, right, that offsets that. And then some of the lines, like the little checkerboard on the right-hand side with the red and the white and the pink, there's a certain freehand element to parts of it. But there still is this precision and this rigor. This is Kandinsky's new style, this new constructivist style of Kandinsky's sort of middle period, right? So he's still interested in non-representational works, but he's dropped these allusions to crusaders, at least so far as I can tell, right? Or churches or rainbows. The forms become even more abstract in his hands. From a portfolio of prints, one of at least 4 that he did while he was at the Bauhaus on the right, a lithograph with, again, a bit more freehand in this particular respect, but still this new interest in geometry. During his time at the Bauhaus, he writes a second treatise on art. Remember, the first one was concerning the spiritual in art, that really talked about color and its relationship to sound and the spirit, right? Its relationship to what it does to the human soul. The second one, Point and Line to the Plane, talks about geometry. And he says that geometric forms are now the bearers of meaning for him, that they have replaced all of his earlier metaphors, visual metaphors that he was using. And there's a line from this, or maybe it's just from a letter by Kandinsky. I love the circle today like I used to love the horse, he says. Right? The circle is his new pal, if you will, his new core symbolism. He said, I perhaps like it even more than the horse because it's got more inner potential. Right? The circle has more inner potential. And this is why it's taken the place of the horse. So these circles that we see everywhere, he's seeing them as sort of, I don't know if they're the bearer of any specific meaning, but they're the place where all meaning can come from, right? They bear inner potential, right? And this leads him to a new kind of art that is similar to his earlier stuff in that he's abandoning direct references to the visual world, but different in that they become more rigorous in their precision. And that's part constructivism, right? But it's part Bauhaus as well, because that sort of engineered style is necessary if you're trying to relate your artworks to something that industry can produce for the world, right? And Kandinsky doesn't see any of these as being prototypes, right? But he's just taking those ideas and he's working them into compositions, right? That any parts of this could be prototypes for something. And they do look like the world's best 1950s flatware that you could find for your house, old 50s designs are fantastic. And often they're ripped off from things like this, right? Now cost you about as much as a Kandinsky. The other artist that was here working in the Bauhaus in this same time frame, another very important hire by Gropius, is Paul Klee. The double E is pronounced A, not E, right? Paul Klee. He's a Swiss artist. And one of honestly, I've probably said this too many times, but if I were to pare down my favorite modern artists to like 3 people, I think Paul Klee would make the list. I just think he's phenomenal. But he's a kind of an acquired taste. And we'll look at him more when we talk about surrealism, because there's a lot of his works that seem to relate to that. But it's important to remember that Klee is also part of the Bauhaus. And in fact, he was hired by Gropius before Kandinsky. He was hired in 1920. Kandinsky came in 21, 22, right? And in fact, it was Paul Klee that convinced Gropius to hire Kandinsky, because Paul Klee had been part of the Blue Rider group back in Munich, right, in 1910 or so. And he and Kandinsky became like famous friends. Like they adored each other. And after the war is over and Klee gets hired at the Bauhaus, he turns around and he tells Gropius, I've got this guy. You probably heard of him. You really should hire him. He'd be perfect for the job. And he and I work really well together. I love this photo. That's Kandinsky on the left and Paul Klee on the right. Right? This is one of my favorite art photos of like all time. Just we're in this together, right? I think that's really fantastic, right? Not that, and Kandinsky's looks so proper, and aristocratic, and Klee looks more kind of scruffy. Let's look at this a little bit more closely, right? What makes this Bauhaus? Well, on the one hand, an extraordinary level of craft. There's a sort of, with all of Paul Klee's work, there's a, what do you want to say? There's a simplicity that could fool you. There's something about it that looks childlike or unskilled. The actual drawing of the architectural forms here is rough, rudimentary, but that's kind of on purpose. He's sort of channeling something primal and simple, which we'll talk more about when we look at surrealism. But you can see that the composition itself is sort of a bank of architecture, right? Of buildings. It's like we're up close to a city square, and we're looking at the buildings in the city square. And some of them give us a sense of recession, such as here in the lower left corner. But the majority of it forms this lattice work across the field. And it's deceptive. That's what I want. Deceptively simple, right? It's because it's not at all. The forms are made through what's called wax resist, right? So what he did was he laid down wax on the sheet. It's on a sheet of paper, actually. Laid down wax on a sheet of paper in the forms that you see here. And then over the top of the wax, right, he did these subtly shaded colors, the sort of patchwork that you see of oranges and off greens and yellows and reds, right? That's, you'll notice, not regular by any means, and sometimes it blends. It's stunningly beautiful the longer you look at it, right? So that's laid over the top of the wax resist, and then you can heat it up, and the wax will come through, and it will reveal the paper underneath it, or whatever was underneath the wax, right? So you get these layers, these subtle layers between them, right? So it looks just like it's a sort of easy drawing in, some sort of, like he's drawing in whiteout or something, right? But that's far from it. It's this extraordinarily elaborate and sophisticated process, right? And you can see that some of the wax is still there around the edges, right? On the frame itself, which is also all handmade, right? And we can see the buildup, and they're sort of playing with happy accidents on it, and we can see the edge of the paper down there, and I'm not quite sure what 138 stands for. Maybe an inventory number or something. Maybe it's the 138th work he did that year. But there's his date, and his signature's in the other corner, lower right. I don't have a detail of that, right? But he's playing with simple forms. And I think the point of that is that there's a sort of a tension between the simplicity of the forms and the extraordinary complexity of the process. That the painting is kind of almost about process, right? And if we think about what they're doing at the Bauhaus, they are studying materials, right? They are studying processes, and they're trying to figure out potentials that no one else had seen up to that point. Right? The cathedral itself is not meant to be any kind of Christian image or Christian potential. In fact, it seems to be sort of a cathedral to all religions in a way. That might be some bow to Kandinsky and theosophist ideas about this one wisdom that infilled all ancient civilization. But there's a crescent moon on top of what is ostensibly the cathedral in the center. Other elements that look quasi-Gothic within it. I think really for Kandinsky, as for Feininger, the cathedral, the idea of a cathedral is not about religion. It's about a metaphor for spirituality, right? Not tied to any one faith, but the idea of what is spirituality? Spirituality is when we transcend the physical world for something better beyond it. And using that as a metaphor in art, Kandinsky did it, right? Feininger did it. Now Klee as well gives us this idea of what they intend their art to do, right? And he really does sort of inspire us to look closely and find these layers amongst layers amongst layers as we look at it, see through it and find more and more. And like I said, it's done on a piece of paper. And so what he's done is he's left the watermark on the paper, right? So that's the letters that you see up there are not written by Paul Klee. This is artist paper. And so when you're working in Mary's classes and you come up with a full sheet, right? If you get the full 30 by 40 sheet, you can find the watermark in the corner, the maker's mark, right? Because it's made on a rack, and then you can sew into the rack various kinds of marks that will identify the paper. And anymore, they're just sort of pressed into it, Reeves BFK or something like that, right? And so Montgolfier, right, is a paper maker. And as he's applying the inks to the paper, right, over the top of the wax resist, right, it's sinking into the watermark more strongly than the rest of it. Does that answer your... Go ahead.
I was just wondering, when he's putting the wax on, is it like melted and he's painting it on?
I think so, yeah, and applied by pen. Yeah, what I would do, I mean, if you're interested in this and thinking about making something like this, if that's the basis of the question, what I would do is get conservators' reports, because I think that with Klee, I mean, the more I look at his stuff, every one of them is just, I don't know how he did it. I mean, I look at it and I kind of get an idea, and I read something that says, oh, it's wax resist, and I kind of know what wax resist is. It's like when you were a kid and you used to make crayon drawings, you know, and you put the crayons down, you put something black and you scratch through it, right? Not dissimilar from that as a process. In printmaking, there's this thing we used to do called sugar lift. I don't know if Mary's talked to you about that, but underneath the printmaking ground, you put water and sort of a thick syrupy water mix, and it will dry, right? And then you put your etching ground over the top of it, and you immerse it under hot water, and it'll bubble through. The sugary stuff will melt and bubble through, and then you get lines that are really weird looking, right? And I think there's somewhere in sort of all of these processes that Klee is working, right? But if we looked at other ones, and we'll have a chance to get back into it, because like I said, I think he's, not only do I find an amazing, when I find the artists that this is not a class about me, but when I find the artists that I like, they're the people that do things I could never do. And I mean that not only technically, but I also mean it insofar as the kind of drawings they do, because I'm finicky, I'm tight, I'm detail oriented, and things have to look exactly like they look in the world. Otherwise, I'm not happy with it. I'm not expressive. I'm kind of anal retentive. In any event, when I look at this, I think I wish I could do something that's simple looking, and just leave it alone when you're done, and not come back in and shade it and make it look more three-dimensional. Anyway, that I think is what makes Klee's work good, though, at the same time. And you'll also notice that idea of using the wax is used again to seal the paper down, right, onto whatever kind of surface is here on the edges, right? And he's somewhat, I think, intentionally rough with how that's coming. And the little red parts where he's got his signature in the title Cathedral in the lower right corner, and there's the signature upper left corner. I was wrong about where it was, right? I think they're just absolutely phenomenal, right? Paul Klee is as good as it gets for modern art for my money. And the Phillips collection, where this one is, they must have a dozen Paul Klays. They're really good, right? And we'll have a chance to look at two or three more when we get to sort of another section of the class. But keep in mind that he's here, 1922 all the way to the end of the 20s, right? Or maybe even all the way to the early 30s. He's working at the Bauhaus as well. So think of this assembly of talent, right, that we have there. Moholy-Nagy, Kandinsky, Paul Klee. I mean, the list goes on, the people that are involved in the Bauhaus in one way or another. Oskar Schlemmer was the head of the sculpture department at the Bauhaus, right? Hired in 1920. So again, all these people right around 1920 are coming together here at the Bauhaus. And here a sculpture by him up in Baltimore that shows us this sort of central Bauhaus ethos. Meld industry with craftsmanship. And in this case, we get this image, and this is something that's typical for Schlemmer's work. That man becomes a machine. And that's really a theme that we've seen dancing around a lot of art around 1920. Stuff from before the midterm. Remember Fernand Léger, the Purist movement, and those later Léger images where we have these sort of robot people that look sort of Art Deco, right? The landscape, the two women that we saw by Léger. Think the Futurists prior to the war, right? Baccioni, well, here, I forgot it was here. Baccioni, prior to the war, working with this idea of mechano men. These ideas seem to be in many people's minds. I think the first, I read this somewhere, and I should put it down in words or in writing so I'd have it. But I think the first mention of the word robot was like 1923, right? In a Czechoslovakian novel by a guy named Lem. That much I know. Not Wilfredo Lem, that's an artist. Somebody with the last name Lem wrote that's the first sci-fi novel with a robot in it, where they use the word, right? And then there's this great German film in the late 20s, like 27, called Metropolis, where somebody builds a robot woman that's going to do his evil work for him, right? But that idea of machine men is a sort of a logical outcome of a lot of the philosophical ideas they're working with. Philosophical is not the right word. Pragmatic ideas that they're working with about using industry, right, to make design that can be reproduced for the masses. And so Schlemmer's sculpture ends up looking, as does Baccioni's in its way, as if it were a series of automotive parts, right? Or bits of maybe airplanes, or bits of locomotives, right? Unlike Baccioni's, it doesn't appear to be striding forward with any great force. He's not trying to capture dynamism and action and movement and change. But what he is doing is understanding that that melding of man and machine, and sort of still this, and even after the war, still this idea that the machine might help us move to the next level, and sharing those ideas with the futurists. Right? I don't think anybody at the Bauhaus is above sort of sharing ideas, right? Picking up things from other modern movements and figuring out how they fit within this new dynamic curriculum where they're going to teach people how everything fits into architecture, right? They just happen to have two Schlemmers there. This is just luck of the draw. There are other artists at the Bauhaus we could talk about, but we don't have good local pictures by them. But these are both, prior to, this one's prior to when he came to the Bauhaus, but the same interest in examining this interrelationship between man and machine, and almost looking like a diagram one might find, a schematic diagram, right? A wiring diagram. Or a construction diagram in a user's manual, right? A repair manual, and painted with industrial materials. The silver is actually silver paint, reflective silver paint, that adds to this overall sense of machine men, that comes out of the Bauhaus. To wrap up the Bauhaus, Schlemmer, because he was the head of sculpture, also became the head of the theater department. There was a Bauhaus theater department as well. And a number of pictures document the Bauhaus theater productions, and they look extraordinary. I mean, they look like just incredibly inventive, and don't you get the sense they're just having the time of their lives and dressing up as puppets, as machines, extending their body around in these mechanical shapes, that skirt of the girl on the left, those circles of that light bulb person second from the right. Everything, even the figure in the back where the body seems to disappear behind the costume, right? It's interesting to think of these in performance, and one can then begin to imagine that there's not a huge difference between this and constructivism. We talked about those constructivist plays that Lissitzky had seen, or between this and the futurists who also staged strange dramas like this, or this and the suprematists, where Malevich can imagine a boy with a backpack as being a black square and a red square. That translation of the human body into something different from its normal physical shape. Just two more Bauhaus photos. It's nice because it's things. Halloween's coming up. Don't you wish you saw this a week ago? Then you can make the most badass Halloween outfit that you'd ever have in your life, right? Maybe next year we should have like a Bauhaus Halloween in the art department, right? And just take these photos and say, I'm going to make that head, right? I'm going to make the silver head with the lips, and we'll walk around with sticks and balls and paint everything, make no colors, and talk in gibberish, as if it were a modern, as if it were really a modern world, right? We just bring it all together just like they did, and we'll do Dada senseless poetry and speak in tongues, right? Sorry, art club, exactly. Have a Dada fair, right? Wouldn't that be phenomenal? And then take pictures outside. We get up on the roof. It's never locked. It's never locked. I'm not telling you to go up there, but it's never locked. But this is, again, the Bauhaus students' building, right? And again, these constructivist angles, right? But just posing for these things as they're getting ready for these performances. And I think the performances spill over, right? They're not meant, we shouldn't think about Bauhaus theater as contained and traditional on a stage somewhere, right? We should think about it as life, as something that spills out and invades all parts of society, because that's kind of what Bauhaus wants to do, right? Is to have it be everywhere. And I think when we see both Bauhaus and the style, and I think this, for me, I find this still 100 years later inspiring, is this idea that they're making art that is meant to create a world where there is so much art in everything that nothing is art anymore. Does that make sense? And in a good way, right? It's not that they don't want art out there. They just want everything to be artistic to the point where there is nothing that isn't art. Therefore, there really is no art. There is only art. Does that make sense? They're sort of breaking down that distinction. Well, what did they ever do? This is the big Bauhaus question, right? There are two Bauhaus buildings ever. The Bauhaus building and a building that they made for an exhibition that they had in 1923. And that is it, right? And both of them, the Bauhaus building that we started off with had to be reconstructed from scraps because it had been after the Nazis. And the other one was a temporary building, right? It was only put up for this big 1923 exhibition. What they did do is furniture and home appliances, right? That was their big thing. And some of these designs are some of the most iconic furniture designs of the 20th century and had a huge impact on well-designed furniture from that day forward, right? So here are two chairs, and I love this with, again, the Bauhaus mask. My wife thinks that's a man. Just the arms. She looked at this, is that a guy in drag? And now I don't know, right? And that would be a very Bauhaus thing to do, would be to gender bend. They're already machine bending, right? So why not? So on the left, two by Marcel Breuer, who was a Bauhaus student, was then hired by the Bauhaus to teach furniture design. You've probably seen the chair on the right. Right? This was designed back in the 20s, and you may have even seen the chair on the left, the famous Vasily armchair, named after Kandinsky, right? With the leather straps. It's very sort of constructivist suprematist with these floating flat areas of abstract geometric shapes, right? Held together by bent chromium steel. Breuer said in designing both of these chairs that he had seen a bicycle, and he realized if a bicycle can hold somebody up with bent steel, then there's a lot of potential there for furniture design, right? So these are the sorts of things that show the Bauhaus commitment to simple form that can be mass-produced, right? And attention to materials and their capacities. Right? These are hallmarks. Form follows function. Right? And Breuer exploiting steel and what it can do to come up with a constructivist, simple piece of furniture with industrial materials. Right? At the same time, the reason that it never really got as far is that many of these materials are incredibly expensive. Chrome is not cheap, right? Or wasn't in the 20s. Even today, it's not cheap. You buy something that's chrome, it's usually plastic, isn't it? Right? Like, I don't know, various parts on my car that are flaking their chrome off anymore, right? Good chrome is hard to find. The Vasily chair was done in leather, right? The straps are leather, so to keep it from stretching. So these things make it, and to buy a Vasily chair now, they're still for sale. You can buy them, right? A Vasily chair will put you back about $1,000, right, for the Vasily armchair. And I don't have the kind of house that's going to look good in anyway, right? I wish I did, but I'm too much of a slob, right? When you have houses like this, Bauhaus houses, you can't leave your T-shirt on the floor from the day before, which I'm prone to do. Great desk furniture. Again, the geometry that we saw in constructivist compositions and in later Kandinsky's. They love sort of spheres and half spheres, circles and cylinders. Everywhere we look, we find these. And again, notice the titles for these. WA24, right? Wagenfeld 24 table lamp. The B Breuer 32 Tonnet chair. You go back and remember Moholy-Nagy was Z7, right? This idea of working with prototypes that can be reproduced. Marianne Brandt, there was a great number of women working at the Bauhaus. The majority of them, very sexistly, were working in textile design. And there's some wonderful Bauhaus textile designs. But Marianne Brandt ended up really with some phenomenal housewares, table lamps that I think still look good today. They haven't dated at all. Right? These are phenomenal. And again, IKEA catalogs nowhere without this stuff. Right? Just again, the simplicity of the form, but also an attention to the materials and how to make industrial material look really beautiful through design. Right? This is the same stuff that you use to make a pig silo. But it looks great because they paid attention to what you're going to do with the surface of it, how you can color that, and still have it look metal. And then the sort of attention to proportions, right? How high design or quality design can turn industrial material into something extraordinary, right? Gorgeous. Look at that, right? I'd own that if I could afford it, right? An amazing teapot. Again, with everything is geometric shapes, right? All half circles, and then the wonderful feet on the teapot, which are just these simple bisecting planes of metal, right? This comes out of this understanding of not only theory and form, but also materials that were at the heart of the Bauhaus, right? So these are designs that came out of it, right? These are some of the most iconic of their designs. There were certainly many, many more than this. but very little in the way of building itself. That's just because I think the ideas were too big to ever really make it in building. That said, it's not hard to find Bauhaus buildings everywhere, Bauhaus-inspired buildings. The DC Public Library is a good place to start, right? I would imagine in the back of the architect's mind, Gaiac Hall might have looked like a Bauhaus building. Sadly, didn't quite work out that way, right? But it's not hard to find that Bauhaus influence in hundreds of places, right? What we call international modernism because of the Bauhaus. Well, as we're looking now at post-war Germany, we're going to turn back to Expressionism. We talked about it a bit with Lionel Feininger, but we want to continue to look at what's going on in Germany after World War I, during and after World War I. In a nutshell, so on the right, George Gross, and on the left, of course, Kandinsky from before. When we look at Expressionism after the war in Germany, I think if we were going to say that there's one big difference between German Expressionism after World War I and German Expressionism before World War I, is that Kandinsky's got hope. Kandinsky wants his art to reflect a sort of perfect utopia. And he wants his art to help you, the viewer, get there somehow, at least visually, but also in your mind. He wants to take us from the world around us to someplace better. And he really firmly believes that art can do that. Art can create a utopia. And after the war, German Expressionism becomes much more bleak. It becomes focused on social criticism. In this particular case, can you read the image? It's a wounded war vet on the street, right? Homeless man. But he's a war veteran. And he is being ignored by the well-fed and wealthy capitalists, right? Walking around him. He's in their way. And yet, for Gross, the message is, of course, that any prosperity Germany might be enjoying in 1922 is the direct result of the suffering of soldiers in World War I, right? He's done his part for the country. Now you can get rich, right? That's the plunder is your affair, right? I've done my part. The plunder is your affair. And his sacrifice leads to their wealth. And he's showing us this as there's no hope. There's no answer from this. He's sort of just shining a flashlight on the dark recesses of contemporary society. Right? This is a horrible thing. What's the solution? He doesn't have one. He shows us the problem. Right? We're supposed to come up with the solution. So it's much more bleak. It tends to be harder to look at. It tends to be rougher. We'll see, sometimes more violent. Right? The fake leg, the false limb of the wounded soldier directly in the foreground. His trauma front and center, his crutches laying there right in the foreground. They're not meant to be attractive pictures. They're meant to show us, through the style of the work, some of the evil that Gross sees in society itself. So it's a very different sort of attitude toward Expressionism than Kandinsky before. It's not about crusading for spiritual value, right? It's not about looking past chaos towards some great beauty and theosophical harmony that exists, and trying to reveal that. It's different from that. But what's similar, I think, and it's important to remember that, Kandinsky really is looking at the material world with some dissatisfaction, right? I mean, why try to create a utopia that's better if you think everything's good here, right? If Kandinsky were totally satisfied with the world, there would be no reason to go to abstraction. It is that dissatisfaction that leads him to look for something else, look for something better. Comes out of a profound dissatisfaction with the world. The only difference is Gross is equally dissatisfied, but he's not giving us any escape. Right? He's confronting us with it. Here you are. This is where you are. Deal with it. Right? Rather than saying, church is on a hill. Right? Rainbows, clearing clouds. I wanted to sort of think about what was going on with Expressionism before the war, before we look at more of these post-war works. Franz Marc, right, equally dissatisfied with society. Right? The whole reason he does images of animals and focuses almost exclusively on images of animals is because he thought humans sucked. Right? That's the only reason he does these, and he even says so in more elegant terms than me. Right? That I turned to animals because I did not like the behavior of the people around me. And I've often said this, when this weekend, right? That man behaved like an animal in Pittsburgh. No, he didn't. Animals don't do that sort of stuff. Humans do that stuff. He was behaving like a human. Animals don't kill each other for no apparent reason. It might be out of territorialism. It might be out of hunger. They will kill each other, but they don't do the kind of savagery we do, right? That's from Franz Marc, right? Is the animal world is an ideal place that's better than the society of the world around us. So there is a sort of this sense with all expressionism of a sort of profound dissatisfaction with the world, and even expressionist movements that aren't expressionist, right? Matisse, yeah. A profound dissatisfaction with the world, find escape into this perfect harmony of color that he creates. Picasso, even for his money, and the Cubist age can be talked about sort of expressionist in that quality, right? Of offering us something different than the world around us, right? In many ways, I think Gross is closest in temperament and even in style to Kirchner, right? Both are revealing ugliness, right? Both focus on modern fashion, right? The well-to-do in the modern city, right? Those who have class, those who have taste, and they show us how ugly they are despite all of that. But again, Gross is not making any quote-unquote bridge, right? He's not hoping that this will help us evolve away from this to something else. I think he does want society to change, but not in this Kirchner, Nietzsche sort of way, of some sort of grand metaphysical evolution. He wants us to wake up and understand the gravity of the injustice that he illustrates. Right? That's what he's really focusing on. So, right, it's here and now. It's not sort of the future, right? So how did this all come to Gross? What happened? He was in the war. Most of the artists we're going to look at post World War I in Germany had actually served in World War I. He'd enlisted in 1914, like good German, I guess, right? Enlisted, it's hard for us to say because we were on the other side, right, after they sunk the Lusitania in 1917. We joined in the last 2 years of the war. He enlisted in 1914. He had a medical discharge, Gross did, in 1915. And then as the war drug on, he was drafted again. After having once been discharged, he was actually drafted back into the military in 1917. And he got a second discharge when he had a mental breakdown. So he had 2 different tours of duty, right? The second one drafted, both resulting in a medical discharge. The second one, he spent time in an asylum because of the horrors he had seen of the war. And most people, when they talk about their experiences of the war, Does this need to be said? It's so different than modern warfare. Well, modern warfare is you push a button and a bomb ends up somewhere else, and you're nowhere near it, and there's no people there on your side. The only people that are there are the people you could bomb the heck out of, right? It really is not. I don't want to sound unpatriotic, but maybe I am. It's not particularly brave. You know, you don't have to engage. You're not really risking much out there. Boom, right? Or you're up here and you've got smart bombs, right? And they can target. You can hit the bowl of rice in that room, right? With that kind of technology. The war, World War I, was hand to hand, right? It was trench warfare. It was mustard gas and tanks, and often they're still fighting with bayonets on their rifles, right? It is hand to hand combat. It's in the mud and the blood and the body parts. It's horrifying in every possible way, right? It was, and people came out of it just as you might imagine. In the same way Vietnam was kind of the last war I think we fought that way, where we would come out of Nam and just, Apocalypse Now just freaked out because this is, jungle warfare, and it ends up being hand in hand because of it being jungle warfare. Modern wars aren't fought that way, right? At least not in our country, right? Guerrilla warfare still does go on. Okay, so Gross in the war, in his 2 different tours of duty, it led to a complete mental breakdown, right? Because of this. And it led him, at the end of the war, to just hate the war, as many veterans end up doing, right? Absolutely detesting the idea of the war and everything that led to it, right? So he's thinking about, not only did he hate this experience that he had to go into twice, but over and above that, he's thinking, how can we stop ever getting there again? And what he identified as primary among the things that led to the war, for Gross, was nationalism. That's probably why he enlisted in the first place, right? He's a nationalist. Fight for the country, right? Mother Germany for him, right? And he began to see German nationalism as being a seed of all that was wrong with society, putting this abstract idea of nation above humanism, above caring about your fellow man. And when this happened, he changed his name. His birth name was Georg Gross, with a S set, the German double S, that's spelled this way. And after the war, he changed it to the anglicized George, and went by George, and changed the S set to SZ, Gross, right? Which is the same way it would be pronounced otherwise, but he doesn't want that uniquely German letter in his name, right? The S set. So part of who he is, even though he's staying in Germany at this point, right, is trying to pull himself apart from the nation and look at it from the outside in a way, right? And stop trying to apologize for what it's doing, but say, it's my country, but it could be better. And here are the things it's doing wrong, right? It's protest. It's social art. Both of these works are from a series. I'm sorry, that was supposed to come up later. Ignore the box for now. Both of these are from a series of prints that he had done. A series of 9 lithographs. Do you guys know about lithography? Should go into that a bit. Early 20th century lithography, right? It's drawn on a stone, on a piece of limestone, right? Thin. It's actually fairly thick, about yay. But one of the special properties of limestone is a crystallized sedimentary stone, right? And one of the things that they learned how to do with limestone back in the 19th century was that you could treat it with chemicals. And what you can do is you can make certain parts of the limestone hydrophobic, water would beat away, and other parts of the limestone hydrophilic, where the water would gather. So if you took a sponge and you wiped the top of the limestone with water, certain areas could stay dry if you treated it properly. So if you drew on with the stuff and you treated it, you could make certain areas stay dry. And so if you have an oil-based ink on a roller and you've got this thin layer of water everywhere except the dry spots, then the ink's going to hit the dry. Right? Does that make sense? So you treat the top chemically, right? Some areas gather water, some areas beat it away. You then roll over the top of that oil-based ink on a roller. And the property that oil and water don't mix means the oil-based ink will hit the dry parts of the stone. And that can then be transferred to a piece of paper when you put the paper over the top of it and pull it off, right? And then the water would just evaporate, okay? So both of these are line drawings made on a piece of limestone that is then printed. It has a significantly shorter shelf life. In other words, you can get fewer prints out of it than you can with a woodcut or an engraving or an etching, right? Because the areas tend to feed in, and then you just grind it off and you do it again, right? Okay, so this is a series of 9 lithographs that he had done as a series, and the titles of all of them are significantly longer than what we have here. That's why we have the ellipses there, right? All of the titles come out of an 18th century play. And in using the titles, he sees them having a direct connection to the modern world. So if you look at the left, the full title, right? Under my rule, it shall be brought to pass that potatoes and little beers shall be considered a holiday treat. Right? Simplest of foods. And the Germans love this term, little beer, right? Bierchen is they say it for just like you're going to go out and have a pint, right? Want to go grab a beer? They say the little beer, right? They like their diminutives. So potatoes and little beers shall be considered a holiday treat. And woe to him who meets my eye with the audacious front of health. Haggard want and crouching fear are my insignia, and in this livery I will clothe you. So again, there's a narrative context for all of that in this play from the 18th century, but he lifts it out of context because he realizes that describes, in this case, modern industrialists counting their money on that tipped down table in the foreground, and then separate perspective for the world behind us, where we see the poor and the wounded who don't have enough, right? And it's a comparison between the fat cats, quite literally the fat cats in the foreground, and the needy in the background, and how the fat cats have more than they need, and other people in society don't have enough, right? Just a simple, straightforward indictment of class difference. Right? I'm going to sound like a Bernie supporter here after a while, right? Is that idea here. Now, sort of skewering excess, right? And you'll notice that Gross is very good with caricature about those 3 guys in the foreground. Their inner traits and qualities are reflected in their outer appearance, right? Ugly as can be. Not that anybody is all that attractive, right, in the background. Well, let's see. Now we'll get to the blue box in the center. In 1925, there was a big exhibition of post-war German expressionism, right, being organized. And Gross was part of this, right? And the curator who's putting it together, you don't need to bother with his name, right? There was a curator putting this together, and he was trying to figure out, with this new show of sort of contemporary German expressionism, right? He was trying to figure out what separated it from earlier German expressionism. How is this different from Katie Kollwitz? How is this different from Kandinsky and Kirchner? Pechstein, right? And he writes in the exhibition catalog an essay that's going to explain what's new about New German Expressionism. And for his money, what he said set Art of the 20s apart from Art of the 10s was what he called a loyalty to a positively tangible reality. Say that again. Loyalty to a positively tangible reality. In other words, they're not trying to be abstract. They are not looking to discover something behind the surface. They are loyal to the surface. Does that make sense? Kandinsky was always trying to pare away, right? Get behind the horse to understand the spiritual qualities of it. Get behind the colors to understand how they related to sound and thus to the human soul. And for these new expressionists, they are loyal to the physical reality, right? The tangible reality. And the term he coins for this is new objectivity. And when he says objectivity, he doesn't mean that they're objective. You know, when we talk about objective now, we think about news reporting, right? As opposed to editorial writing, right? That one is objective, one does not bring opinion into it. That's objectivity. The other one, editorial writing, is purely objective, right? It's all about your opinion. And when he says new objectivity, he's not talking about being unopinionated. He's talking about being loyal to objective reality, being loyal to the physical object, right? It's non-objective in that it's personal, right? It's opinionated. But it's not non-objective when we talk about art, because when we use the term non-objective for art, we're talking about abstraction, right? So this is a new objectivity. German word, it's a mouthful, Neue Sachlichkeit, right? New objectivity. New objectness is really what that means, right? And that became the term that stuck for all of this post-war abstraction. Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity. For the exam, new objectivity will be fine, right? You don't have to worry about spelling German words, right? But the term, it's important for us to remember that the term was not a term that Gross invented. It was not a movement like the Blue Rider. It didn't have a manifesto, right? It wasn't like the Cubists. It was rather a term that a curator gave to them, to a bunch of different artists who probably didn't even know each other, right? That were lumped together because they seemed to be following similar leads, right? So it's a non-movement movement, if you will, right? It's not really an ism in the same way. Well, here's some of the difficult stuff, right? Images of violence, numerous of them in New Objectivity. In this case, a murder of a prostitute. Is she missing her head? There's an axe there. Pretty graphic as well, considering the sort of simplified line quality of Gross's work, right? The term lust murder was a term that was actually being used in early psychoanalysis. It was coined around 1900 by a psychiatrist named Krafft Ebing. Have you ever heard of Krafft Ebing? He came up with sadism and masochism as well, right? The same psychiatrist who came up with those terms. Also came up with the term lust murder. In other words, a murder committed during sex, right? And what? It's basic instinct, right? It's like a gazillion horror films. It's every slasher film you've ever seen. Although in this case, it's one of the people, right? Not like Michael Myers, right? Getting them after they're done, or Friday the 13th or whatever, right? It's the one of the people and in this case, the man killing his partner, right? And for Gross, this idea of the death of the prostitute at the moment of intimacy, of some sort of intimacy, right? Physical intimacy, he sees that as a metaphor for the evils of society, the people that we are, quote unquote, in bed with, right? Our social peers, we are often horrible to. We commit crimes akin to murder. We maybe don't kill them, but we certainly don't treat them very well. And this becomes then a metaphor for broader social problems, right? Broader social evils. And again, I'm sorry, but these are part of the dialogue, right? He's not the only one doing them. These sort of really difficult scenes of murder and destruction as a metaphor for uh, the horrors of the world. This is a dry point, right? And you guys know about dry points from Mary's class. This is where you scratch into the copper with a piece of steel, a steel needle, right? Without actually etching it, you're actually just dragging it through, and I don't know. For Dix, it might be also there's something about it that it can be kind of violent feeling. You're kind of attacking the plate, and you understand you're gouging it. In a way you don't if you're etching, or even I think with woodcut, because there's something a little bit more delicate about it. The lines you're doing are quick and immediate, and you're scratching the heck out of that plate. And I get a feeling that for Dix, this image, this horrifying image, where she's been hacked at as well, there's something going on there that's creepy in itself, and it adds to the violent way, at least that I read, even the areas around her, the stuff on the ground or in the background, right, have that same sort of violence. But again, like Gross, Dix sees this as exactly the same metaphor, right? The lust murder is a metaphor for injustice, the cruelty that only humans have for their fellow man. Now, he sort of translates it over into the animal world as well. The prostitute, of course, is the impoverished woman of society who doesn't have any other choice in life but to do this. Right? That is her only, he's siding with her. Right? She's been put in this position. She doesn't have other options to survive in modern society. We have a society that puts somebody in that place in the first place. Right? That's horrifying. And what's more horrifying is it puts her in danger of this. Right? Because she's astray. Right? She has no home otherwise. And he backs that up. And I don't know why I taught this for years and I never saw the dogs. Right? But there's that little stray scruffy dog getting the heck humped out of it. Right? By the darker and darker, right, figure. The evil dog on top of it. There's that same metaphor played out through it. But everything looks as if it's been attacked, doesn't it? Torn up, scratched, and bloodied sort of everywhere we look. I want to talk about one issue. We'll look at more Dix after the next class and finish up this section. I wanted to bring up an issue that's very good to talk about with these two things on the screen, and that's about this question of aesthetics. Does art need to be beautiful? Right? Yeah. But the problem is, Dean is a firm no, it doesn't. Right? And I totally agree. Right? And it's a long-standing question in aesthetics about what makes art art. Is it simple? And but you put Matisse in this room, and we've got an argument, don't we?
Yeah.
Right? A number of people you put in this room, and you're going to have an argument. Cezanne in this room. But at the same time, there's this question about the visual experience and what creates what's more important with the visual experience, beauty or emotional impact? Beauty or moving you, right? And making something an indelible experience that you simply cannot forget. Would you rather have something that's beautiful and boring, right? Hotel art, or some. I could point to things on campus. I'm not going to. Or would you rather have something that you would never want to own it, but you'll never forget it? And for works of art that are attempting to alert society to its evils, one is certainly a better avenue than the other. Right? And this argument has been around for a really long time. Going back to the end of the 18th century, there was this term that was coined called the sublime, right? And what the sublime meant to artists of the 18th century, early 19th century, was any aesthetic experience. It could be music, art, literature, where it had a profound and lasting impact. That was a sublime experience. It could even be in nature, right? You could even walk out a waterfall, right? Standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon can be a sublime experience. We misuse the term all the time. Banana Split was just sublime. Well, maybe it was unforgettable, but you know, it's a banana split. It's not sort of wouldn't measure up. These are sublime works in that they try to create a visual experience through horror that's impossible to forget. Right? And here we are in a fine arts class and we're looking at this, but you know, it's Halloween, right? And there's a new Halloween movie out where apparently I haven't seen it. I saw the.
It's good.
Did he rip somebody's teeth out of their head?
Well, you don't see it happening, but it does happen.
It does, but you do in other films. You do see it happen in other films. And yeah, because we just got done watching the original again, right? From '78, the one that came out when I was in high school. And which I didn't see when I was in high school because it was too gory. Now it's like, right? But you know, the Saw movies, right? And I have no tolerance for these. Hostel and all of that, right? The Eli Roth canon. I'm not a big fan of gory films, right? And I've tried. Dr. Howe got me to try to get into gory films because she's all over these things, you know. Go watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You know, you've got to see this and Dead Alive or something. And then I'm queasy. And I'm queasy with these as well. But those things have that same issue, right? Of film that's put forth it's not meant to be beautiful, right? In that case, it's meant to be scary. But in this case, it's not meant to be so much scary as it is meant to sort of say, I think of all the pictures you saw today, are these the ones you'll never forget? And it's not because we spent more time on them, but I mean, I think they're extraordinarily profound in the emotional impact that they have through violence. Right? And that idea of art and ugliness, right? We've already talked about with Kirchner, right? I'm not a big fan of. We're going to talk about it again when we get to some abstract expressionist, de Kooning, who I find really consciously difficult, right? So we have that here. So anyway, that's we're a few minutes late. Sorry about that. So we'll finish up Neue Sachlichkeit on Friday, and the other thing we'll do on Friday then is move on to Dada, which is like about my favorite 20th century movement. It'll be yours when I'm done. I promise you'll like it when we're finished. Yeah, that's why you're taking the class. You'll learn. I didn't either when I